So I know what you're going to say. The secret weapon for Van Halen's debut album is... But that's not it. So maybe it's... That's not it either. And as much as I love... The secret weapon is so statistically improbable that it's a wonder this album ever got made, and it would not sound the same if things hadn't come together the way they did. All that coming up. So Van Halen's debut album absolutely changed everything for rock and roll in 1978. Nobody had ever heard anything quite like this, and it was the detail-oriented work of Ted Templeman mining the sounds of four very unique individuals who came together to create something absolutely extraordinary. Now, believe it or not, this was not my first Van Halen purchase. I actually got into them a little later, and I bought this album first. And I got into a lot of trouble because there was a picture of David Lee Roth chained to a fence and some bondage thing, so my parents were not pleased. At any rate, when I finally did buy this album, I was already playing guitar, and I could hear right away something unique was going on. The more we looked into what Eddie Van Halen was doing, at the foundation of all that really was incredible tone. Certainly, some of that was just the man's hands and his ears, but his attention to detail in terms of dialing in the sounds that he needed, hot rodding amps with a Variac, and all kinds of other little tricks he had that became part of his trade, were something extraordinary and something we'd never seen before. But that still was not what gave us one of the greatest debuts of all time. The list of acts that Van Halen opened up for on stage included Black Sabbath, Journey, and Ted Nugent, and each of those acts knew that this band was not just a fluke on stage. I think everyone who plays and millions of people who don't play understand the impact of this album. So the real secret weapon to this album is the fact that these four guys got together in Pasadena, California, found each other at Pasadena City College, which I attended for a brief time, built their band and their sound into absolute global domination. Think about it. If Sammy Hagar had been invited by the band or Ted Templeman in on this first album, it would not have sounded the same. And I'm actually not part of the whole Sammy versus Dave thing. I love both versions of the band. I thought some amazing music came out of that. In fact, I wish Gary Sharon had stayed around longer to make more albums and that Mitch Malloy had come in. I love to see stuff like that. However, if David Lee Roth had not been on this album doing what he did, would not have sounded the same. Just think about if Billy Sheehan had come in. He's a tremendous bass player and an equally gifted vocalist. But that signature Michael Anthony super high harmony would not have sounded the same. And as great as Wolfgang did in the last days of the band, and he did a great job. The guy takes a lot of shit that he does not deserve because he got to play with his dad and his uncle, did a phenomenal job of actually bringing us Van Halen again. As great as he did, Michael Anthony is still the signature sound in those upper harmonies. So statistically, the fact that these four guys could come together, create a sound over time, and create this album, that is the secret weapon. You miss any one of those guys, and it does not sound the same. Especially when you consider the fact that there was a kind of DNA groove between Alex and Eddie Van Halen that probably had its roots in their dad, who was a phenomenal jazz musician who immigrated with his family to the United States, Jan Van Halen. The groove and the swing that the Van Halens had just was not super extant in lots of rock music of their contemporaries at all. So when we get into the songs, the songwriting on this album is phenomenal. Now there are bigger songs like Running with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love that do a little less for me than, say, Feel Your Love Tonight or Atomic Punk. Some of those have incredible energy and grooves that I kind of prefer more, but there is not a dud on this entire album. Now, of course, we could talk at length about Eruption, and maybe that is the secret weapon to what made Van Halen great. For sure, it changed guitar in ways that we still calculate even 40 years later. At the time when I was coming up, everybody said, Eddie Van Halen's just fast. That's all he is. Well, there were lots of fast players out there, but no one really sounded exactly like him. Then the other argument is, well, he didn't invent tapping. No, he didn't invent strings and picks either, but nobody else sounded like him using those very fundamental tools. Did Eddie Van Halen have his own secret weapon? He absolutely did. He had an ability to create tone, and people like to say it was in his hands. It absolutely was. The guy had enormous hands. I saw him from the fifth row a few years ago, I think in '04, a bunch of years ago actually. And his hands were enormous. Playing those licks was just, it was like not even breaking a sweat for him. One of the real secrets to early Van Halen tone, though, is Van Halen's ears. They were so finely tuned that a lot of guys who were around him in the same scene just didn't have any notion of how to pursue tone in the same way. And that's why you have a guy who ended up building his own custom guitar, hybridizing his own amp, using a variac to lower the voltage to get that great brown sound. That was all part of the Van Halen sound. Now, could Eddie Van Halen pick up a coffee table and make it sound great? Yeah, he was kind of one of those guys like Prince who can just pick up whatever's in the room and start making music on it. But the real secret weapon to the entire sound of the album, and I guess you could factor Ted Templeman and Don Landy in too, because they were capturing sounds that really were not captured by Gene Simmons' demo that he did of the band a few years before. That's no disrespect to Gene, just needed a producer who could capture the sound of this band in a way that we all grew to know and love. And actually, my understanding is that the band did not love the sound on this album. It's a little more wet than they really wanted, but still managed to make at least 10 million of us very, very happy. So you have the four guys coming together in a statistically improbable fashion, creating a very unique sound where if you subbed any one of those guys out, it would not sound the same. And they already had songs that were first rate. All Ted essentially had to do, according to him, was set up a bunch of mics and just have them go. Now, obviously, Don Landy managed to capture an amazing Van Halen guitar sound, and with strategic placement of Michael Anthony, who I guess can sing at just phenomenal levels in terms of volume, they were able to create a balance with those backing harmonies, which are a signature part of the Van Halen sound. If you listen to Sammy Hagar in The Circle or Chickenfoot, and you hear he and Michael Anthony today on those albums, Michael Anthony is a huge part of that sound. You just cannot substitute any one of these guys and still get the same album. That may seem really obvious, but to me, that is the secret weapon of this album. And I'm a huge Eddie Van Halen fan. Completely changed my life, colored my guitar playing, my approach to the instrument. But if Van Halen had been dropped in any other band, you could still notice it was Eddie Van Halen, but you might not have the songwriting, the singing, the harmonies, the overall attitude, certainly not the groove. And that brings us to Alex Van Halen, who, according to Mike and Sammy, used to drive producers a little nuts with his incredible, insane approach to detailed tone on his drums. And Eddie actually came out and said he was trying to get the brownest sound possible, as close to Alex's snare as possible. And I'm here to tell you, for me, it wasn't so much the snare, but it was kind of the combination of the snare and the hi-hat work, the cymbal work. It was just really edgy, crashy. 3 notes in, and I knew I was hearing Alex Van Halen. It would almost be interesting to hear Alex in another setting. I don't know that we ever will. And I'm certain on some levels he'll always grieve his brother's loss, as will Wolfgang and the rest of the family. But it would be great to hear Alex out there doing what he does again, because as a drummer, I think it's incredibly difficult to create a signature sound that's so immediately identifiable. Phil Collins kind of had that going on with the gated thing he had going in the 80s. Even my favorite drummer, Neil Peart, somewhat had a signature sound, but I'm not sure it was as recognizable as Alex Van Halen. It just was an attention to detail that took him in a certain direction, and his brother too. And it helped create a sound that we've never really recovered from fully. So for a lot of us, the Van Halen debut is an absolute game changer. Even if you're not a musician, there are at least about 9 million of you who maybe more. I'm not exactly sure what the album count on this is, but I know it has diamond certification, which is over 10 million. So this album absolutely changed the face of music. The band changed the face of live performance. Without Van Halen, we would not have the same musical climate that we have today. And for me, the real secret weapon is the combination of these four guys. You substitute any one of these four guys for any other guy, you do not have the same album. It might be an interesting album, it's not going to have the same sound. And that is an amazing secret weapon, given the probability of those four guys coming together and staying together as long as they did. So that's going to do it for me. I know I've done a lot of Rush, and I will actually get back to them. And I've got some other bands in the works too. I just love talking about this stuff, and I love hearing what you guys have to say. A lot of you have greater knowledge than I do about some of this stuff, so it makes for really amazing conversations. At any rate, that's it for me. We'll talk to you soon.